Engineering, Magic and Kitsune, Chapter 35, Patrol. Before they went to the building, they checked the rest of the couple's landmarks. Although they turned up nothing more than a few more entrances to the Nameless Nest and what appeared to be a few shrines, the spread of the Nameless Nest exits was honestly worrying, and John was starting to suspect that it might be like a damn city down there. They had that whole space warping nonsense going on, after all. They could fit down and take their route down that narrow tree trunk. It wasn't natural. Who knew how far the network stretched underneath? The only small mercy is that they probably aren't the strongest diggers, given they hadn't tried to dig up into his fort rather than sieging it. So it'll likely take them some time to hit the surface once they collapse the entries. He had an idea on how to do that, and now that he thought more in depth about it, he may have a good idea on how to do that, but it would require good, long lines of sight, which can only be achieved via flight. It was luck that the Nameless couldn't fly. Although, if what Yuki mentioned about levitation was true, if someone practiced was able to fly by walking or leaping off the reinforced air, that might mean the greater Nameless was able to fly, in a sense. That thought was awful, and he hated having come up with it. He shook his head, bringing him back to the present, as a group lurked outside the suspected drop-off point, creeping through the woods with the greatest of care. "Do you sense anything, Yuki?" he whispered, barely audible even to himself, but he knew she'd hear. The Kitsune's damned hearing made him jealous sometimes. Then he thought about how intolerable it would be to live in a city if you had a neighbor with peculiar tastes. He stopped feeling quite as jealous after that. She sniffed the air, and her ears twitched in various directions, like a parabolic microphone scanning the forest. Her face quirked into a frown, and then she did the universal gesture of being unsure, holding her hand level before rocking it from side to side. "Let me guess, no sounds, but it smells too much like Nameless," he whispered, and she nodded in return. John winced and scanned the area with his Nameless detector, but came up with nothing. "What's the range the greater Nameless can control the puppets in?" he quietly asked. "Further than here to the nest," Yuki quietly returned, and he nodded. The bodies were likely around then, not as if the hollow corpse would need many resources to maintain. And if the smaller Nameless they used to puppet them were anything like the large ones, they could stay still for a very, very long time without worry. Right, so they were probably around, but in storage somewhere. That complicates things. "We still need to make sure this is their drop-off point, rather than something else," he added with a frown. "For all we know right now, this could be a lure for travelers or something." "Then we press on," her statement, although quiet, was absolute. The three crept closer, and Yuki warned them of no tripwires. They must be worried about giving away their presence to some degree. Well, the average person wouldn't think much of a few threads of spider silk. Someone well experienced in dealing with Nameless would probably see the trap for what it was, and alert forces far more than what they could deal with. After all, a species of ill-tempered, able to spread like the Nameless, was truly an existential threat to any civilization ill-prepared, and needed to be dealt with quickly. Even with guns, he couldn't imagine most towns or small cities back home would deal well with them, especially if they could slip in puppets. The trees thinned, and soon enough a building appeared from between the trees. It was simple, undecorated, and featured thick earthen walls and plaster framed by wood. It was not massive, perhaps 80 feet from one end to the other, but it took up the entire clearing it was in, with trees scraping against the edges. 2 floors, unless it had a basement, but he doubted it did. There may be an office. There was a single raised section towards the edge of the steepled roof that looked much like a loft of some description, and bore the only windows John could see from this side. Finally, there was a thick double door made out of large planks with a dense knot of rope tied between the handles, but no lock. "That's bait," he muttered, glowering at the door. If there was anything that had a string tied to it, it was that. Yuki nodded in agreement, pointing to the closed oval window on the loft, too. "All the entrances are certainly trapped. The underside of the roof likely has a smoke vent, though. Do you have that tool of yours that melts things?" she asked, glancing towards his pack. Nodding, he put his bag down and rooted through his pack, holding out the device. When the Kitsune grabbed it, he did not release, his lips tightening for a moment. "Do you need any pointers on how to use this?" he tersely asked, barely above whisper. Yuki shook her head. "No, I watched you use it plenty," she responded. If it were anybody else, he doubted that would be enough, but Yuki was unnervingly observant at the worst of times. Releasing it, she gave him an appreciative nod before spinning around and silently lurking forward, unhidden by any sort of disguise. Her ears were on swivel, twisting this way and that, to catch 1,000 sounds he was not privy to. Her eyes scanned the path for threats, but her tails were eerily still. Once she was next to the building, she crouched before springing up onto the roof with barely a sound. She crept over to the top edge, and after peeking over the side, she grabbed onto it and swung under, disappearing from view except for her fingers and her tails gently waving in the breeze behind her. A few moments later, she swung outwards, then in, disappearing entirely through whatever opening she made. He knew it was going to happen, but deep-seated dread shot through John nonetheless. If she needed support, what would be the best way to hurry over to help her? Would it be best to burn through the front door? That may expose him to any traps that they had in wait. Use the excavation focus to tear through the side wall. That would be slower. "Sensei," a voice whispered to his side, and he whipped around to face Rin. The speed made her jolt, and she leaned back, although he thankfully didn't draw his weapon on her this time. "Sensei, what should we do?" Rin's eyes drifted to the suspected warehouse, lingering on it for too long before going back to him. "We stay low, and we wait," he quietly replied. The unbound looked unhappy at this, looking away for a moment as the lips curled into a frown. John took that moment to place his backpack down so that it wouldn't make a noticeable lump and began to disguise himself. "What are you doing?" she harshly whispered, not reproachfully, just more in disbelief. John looked at her curiously, pausing his impromptu forest debris burial. He stared at her, only realizing how strange this must look for a moment later. "Look," he said, gesturing at the leaves and branches he had already half covered himself in. "We're in a divot. It would look very natural from a distance, and it would only take maybe half a second to get myself out." "It is," Rin trailed off, seeming to be careful to pick her words, staring past him. "Beneath your station." "We do not have the luxury to complain about how we can best win. We're facing down a disaster," he breathlessly whispered. "They are a swarm of countless monsters that'll happily kill every single person they can to hoard as much wealth as possible. If we fail, this town will be turned into a withered husk, merely clinging onto life. If they don't outwardly act, it'll be written off as a simple result of war or bad fortunes. Then it'll happen again, then again, then again." John paused, gesturing down at the pile of forestry that he was using as camouflage. "What if we failed due to not grabbing every advantage we can? Would their blood not be on our hands? Below me or not, this might make the difference. Now, get down." Conflict warred in Rin's gaze as she twitched uneasily, looking toward him, but her mind was somewhere else, and her legs twitched like she was going to bolt. "I see," was all she finally said after a long silence, lying down close to him and uneasily covering herself in plants and dirt. He provided a few tips as she did so, allowing her to make a far more convincing cover. By the time he was done, anyone would have a hell of a time finding her, assuming they didn't have superhuman senses, at least. But those seemed rather rare. The only confirmed example he had so far was Yuki. The nameless weren't too terribly observant, other than having an eerie ability to locate money, given how good they were at scraping traders and their carts clean. Minutes passed, and a knot of anxiety started to form in his gut. This was taking too long. Should he intervene? Surely, if anything happened, Yuki was too strong for them to overpower without a sound, right? But what if there was some variant of nameless they hadn't seen yet, or if they'd fallen for the bait? The greater one could be in there right now. He heard Rin shift at the side, suddenly alert. "Sensei," she harshly whispered, "there's people coming." "Stay low," he quickly ordered, falling back on instinct. "Maybe they'll pass." It was a time-honored trick that had served him well over the years, but if they were coming for the warehouse, he had to hope and pray that Yuki was all right. Soon enough, he heard them coming too. Several sets of footsteps and some hoof steps approached. John turned towards the noise as much as he could without disrupting his camouflage. They came through the trees like spectres of ill tidings, ill portents of a conflict to come. The group numbered around 30 armored men, some of whom he recognized from previous clashes with the tax collectors, while others he didn't. They formed a loose box around the large horse-drawn cart, all on alert. Their faces looked tense and scared, although the man driving the carriage seemed angry more than anything, almost like a volcano about to erupt. Wait. John recognized the driver, Sergeant Ch.35. He had seen the man around before, when they were faced off with the tax collectors outside Ike and Harry's home. He had led the tax collectors and was ready to sick that undead monster on them before the militia arrived. He seemed a bit different, though. John had remembered the man with far more scars, and the way he scanned the forest was less like a man looking for threats and more like a hawk looking for prey. Upon the back of the cart, next to several large metal-banded chests, John spotted 2 more men sitting on the rear, and pointedly not dressed in any armor despite their high-quality clothes. Unbound. The damn tax collectors had recruited some unbound. Was that where their leader had gone off to fetch aid? Eyes straying even further back, he saw the undead separated from the group and marching 30 paces behind. The way it walked was as if it were trudging. That couldn't be right. He knew it felt fear from when he almost toasted it with a lightning bolt, and it stepped back. But did it feel other emotions, too? Did it not want to be there? He felt a gnawing terror bubble up and watched all of them march closer. They were surely going to drop off some loot, weren't they? If there were nameless or puppets inside the building, they would smell whatever coin they had in the chests and wake up. Fuck! No, he had to stay calm. He had to take a deep breath, trying to center himself as the threat loomed ever closer. Those men, they weren't mindless killing machines like the nameless. They could be convinced to leave, but what if he couldn't manage it? What if he couldn't intimidate them into giving up? They'd be giving up first-strike privileges, and they'd be surrounded, and then the thought of a man he burned a scant few days ago, writhing on the ground in agony as he called out for help, surged unbidden to his mind. A shiver came over him as he fought down the bile in his throat. What if he had to fight? Even if Yuki stepped back out the way she came, she'd be in the line of sight now. Could he stomach having to hurt another person? A terrible insectoid scream resounded from the warehouse, and bright golden light spilled through the cracks, followed by an awful crunch. His blood turned to ice, and a sense of great and terrible calm washed over him as the tax collectors and their allies stiffened. Orders were shouted by Sergeant Shirai at their head, and they dismounted, although John couldn't hear the exact words of his heart racing. Red went to rise to join the combat, but he impulsively reached over and pressed her back to the ground. She let him. No, he hissed. She started to protest, but he turned to face her, and she stopped dead. John turned back to the men, now charging, and maneuvered his gauntlet to poke out of the nest of camouflage. The heat focus was loaded in. He held an elevated position, one that allowed him to avoid worrying about scorching the grass and giving away his angle. They weren't looking at him. He aimed. He prepared. He fired. The beam silently scorched the leg of the first man before he even knew what was happening. The leather armor around the back of his legs burned and wrapped around the attack like plastic tossed into a campfire. Perhaps it would at least provide some protection if this were just a stream of fire. But it wasn't. It was pure heat, magically driven by powers that none back home could dream of harnessing. The beam passed through in an instant of exposure, pointing the limb on the body. The man went down with a scream, writhing in agony. John dragged the line of like invisible death over the back line at the same height, claiming limb after limb like a dark prize. The charge faltered. The confusion of the ambush prompted them to spin around, looking for their foe, only to see nothing but their own comrades in agony. John faltered for a moment, seeing the terrified face of the man who was next in line. His eyes darted from place to place, scouring the woods for any hint of him, but coming up blank. Yelling, he drew his bow back and fired at enemies that existed only in his mind, arrows flying into distant trees or skittering across the ground. John's hand moved on its own, and the man went down all the same into a screaming heap. Another brought a massive shield up. The beam passed through it all the same, although John had to swipe the ray across the area as he didn't know where the legs were behind it. They were on the verge of breaking. He could feel it. He could see the way they panicked, how they looked every which way for their attackers. "Form up!" a voice shouted, moving with an unnatural power as presence cascaded over them. It felt like steel against his mind, even 100 feet out, and the men stiffened before obeying almost like automatons, locking into a tight formation as they were drilled on it. The panic before was suppressed, unnaturally so. It was one of the unbound, a tall man with slicked back hair, who looked to be in his 40s and had a rat-tail training behind him, who gave the order. He stood amongst the formation with no sign of fear on his face, and the other, a younger man in his 20s, stood by his side. Both had long, graceful adachi drawn. "There!" the younger man shouted, pointing at their position. John cursed. "Get them!" the older man ordered, and John finally cast off the debris and jumped to his feet, with Rin following not far behind. She stayed at his side for but a moment, drawing her blade and holding it out in front of her, and suddenly surging forth, not towards the formation but past it, towards the real threats, towards the back where just the two unbound, Shirai and the undead who stood in front of him protectively. It had pulled two blades out of its bizarre, mottled, melted wax-esque head, holding one in either hand. John had already cut down perhaps half their number, but they still charged with an unnatural coordination. He cursed, aiming towards the charging mass as they crossed the distance. Between them, time seemed to slow. On their faces, there was an unnatural calm, but he could see that there was an occasional twitch as their features contorted into something else before faltering, as if they were fighting to be terrified. Grouping them up was the wrong thing to do. He swept the beam across their legs. There were 5 men across and 3 deep, and the first 2 ranks went down as they should. His fingers twitched a bit too tightly. The beam intensified. Flesh flash boiled, bone crumbled, and 9 men went down, missing their legs entirely, as the invisible beam scythed through them like dry grass. Little blood shot forth, the wounds instantly cauterized as they were. For a moment he stood there dumbly, staring at what he did. There was 9 men who would never walk again, who wouldn't. The blade clashing against his skull tore him out of his thoughts, his warding flaring to life in an intense burst of green as it took most of his blow. But he was still sent into a tumble into a tree, with a resounding crash as he was sent through the trunk, sending splinters as it was toppled. Adrenaline muted the pain as he stumbled back to his feet. He couldn't take another hit like that, not without warding popping. He was damned sure it needed time to recharge. Shaking the stars out of his vision, he looked towards his aggressor. It was the old man, blade held out in front, a wicked but tense smile held into his face, looking almost like it was stuck there. "I see the rumors of the bandits in these woods are true," he spat. "Tell me, what crime did you commit that you must scrounge for these scraps? Or do you just enjoy killing without having a stomach for risk? I hear there is plenty of market for foreign mercenaries at the front right now." His voice was bitter, venomous, and the way he said every word made it seem like he had a vendetta against them. John was happy to keep him talking while his warding recharged. "There are nameless in these woods, you know," he said. "Those tax collectors are just puppets to them. You have to know that, right?" The man didn't react, tilting his head. "You must know that the heavens take nameless infestations seriously, correct? Even out here, they deal with it quickly." His voice did not lose any of its former bitterness, but it sounded almost rehearsed. John glanced down towards his gauntlet and traded heat focus out for the freezing focus. "Perhaps, but you're implying they know everything?" he asked, tilting his head. "It has been kept strangely under wraps, almost like they're smarter than usual." He began to circle the man, keeping an eye on him like he was sizing up his prey, and his foe responded in kind, which suited him just fine. After all, he just needed to get his backpack. This man closed fast. He had a decisive movement advantage. John would not let that remain the case. With a burst of blinding speed, the man lunged, ready to try and decapitate John on the spot. That was what he was waiting for. Raising his gauntlet, he set his fingers to ensure that the ensuing attack would cover a wide cone and let loose. The man staggered in his wild charge, but his Igus held under the stress, even as supernatural cold ate away at it. But that was not the point. No, the point was to ice the ground under him. His wild charge couldn't be stopped this night, and he fell headfirst into the ground as he lost all traction, rolling across the field as his sword went clattering away. John kept the beam on him, wearing him down as he sprinted to the backpack on aching legs, snagging a winged disc from the side and turning it on. "Bastard!" the man shouted, getting back to his feet, holding his hand out. After a moment, his adachi rose from where it had fallen and shot back into his hand. Some sort of magnetism control, maybe. No, his presence felt a lot like an unyielding steel wall, hadn't it? It had to be some sort of metal control ability. Did that mean that he could summon metal from nowhere, just like Rin summoned things related to storms? Or did he only work with what he had on hand? Some frost marred his clothing, but he looked otherwise unscathed. That would change soon. The man sprinted towards him, and John disabled the speed limiters on the disc, flying straight up at the last second and dodging yet another bull-like charge. The momentum carrying the Unbound far past where he had launched from. He was fast, sure, but he didn't turn that well, did he? Moreover, he seemed to favor getting in close to his opponents, where he then tried to tear them apart. If he had any good projectile attacks, John wagered he probably would have opened with them before charging in to knock him off balance and cover the approach. John raised his gauntlet again, aimed at the man, and fired a narrow, much more concentrated beam of sheer cold. He tried to charge, but John tracked him. The invisible beam formed a sheet of ice over his chest from the ambient moisture. The man shouted out in pain as the cold seeped through the Igus, biting into his flesh. John swapped out the cold focus for lightning, staring down his opponent far below. The man flexed, tearing away the frosty, brittle clothes he wore, and threw his blade. John barely had any time to react as the man leapt into the air, landing on the back of the sword, and started flying towards him at a meteoric speed. John's eyes widened, and he instinctively aimed dead at the man, cranking the power to maximum, and fired. The world went white even as his warding dimmed the flash. The thunder roared in his ears, borderline deafening him even as it dulled the deafening crash. He had only realized what he had done as he saw the man's half-popped corpse fall onto the earth below. The lightning had broken his icus, frying him from the inside out as it turned whatever flesh was in the path into rapidly expanding gas. John stared. No, he was just he didn't. An explosion caught his attention, and he whipped around to find the source. His blood chilled once more. The doors were blown wide open, and the building was going up in flames. Nearby, Yuki was putting herself back to her feet, a feral snarl on her muzzle. Rin lay on the ground, awkwardly propping up against a tree, but thankfully still moving, with her opponent dead nearby, chopped in half at the waist. Shirai fled into the undead close on his heels, and several far too large spider legs grasped the edge of the door as a giant pulled itself from the confines of the warehouse. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.